as the things that matter to me in life around basketball and transportation and supply chain, I do think there's one really cool analogy that I want to talk about that is something that I've thought about a lot over the last couple of decades, and hopefully will be at least one thing that may stick in your mind when you're thinking about our industry and kind of how it's changing and the way things work. For those of you who are not basketball fans and don't follow it like some of us in the room, what you may not know is back in the day, sort of right around when Jerry West was finishing up his career, there was a lot of concern that the game was slowing down, getting boring. There was a lot of four corners stalling, holding the ball. There were too many big guys. And so they started to look at rule changes that might positively impact the game. And the poll question is, in 1980, where my worlds collided, is that is when they put the three-point shot in. They had put the shot clock in sooner. It's also the same year that transportation deregulated. So 1980 was a big year for me, looking back on it. And you know, the interesting part of it is thinking about how these rule changes have affected the game of basketball and how they've affected the supply chain and logistics industry and kind of the relationship between rulemaking, innovation, iterations, and how those things change. So the slide that's up there now, first off, if you didn't know, Jerry West is in fact the prototype for the NBA logo. So when you see that, you can think of, if you didn't know that already, that he is a big deal in the NBA. But in 1980, when they put this three-point shot in, part of the goal with that and the shot clock was to speed up and spread out the game of basketball to make it more interesting. And what the top chart, or I guess what both charts are showing, is that in fact that has worked. For those of us who are junkies and watched Golden State and Cleveland play again this year in the NBA Finals this summer, you know, what you saw is the continuations of those trends, that possessions per game and three-point percentage, or the percentage of three-point shots taken and made are at all-time highs after 38 years. So from 1980 till today, those rule changes in the NBA, looking back on them, were an enormous deal. Jerry West commented yesterday that they'd have won another NBA championship if they'd have had it, because he heaved a three-quarters court shot and counted for 2 points, and they lost in overtime. So it would change the outcomes of games, and it certainly changed some of the strategies. Now, similarly, some of us in the room are old enough to go back to kind of the deregulation of transportation. You may know that in 1980 as well, one of the things that the government was unhappy about is that our transportation industry was regulated and that there was a lot of corruption around operating authority and limited access. Pricing was regulated, operating authority was regulated, and similarly, the government made a big rule change in 1980 that very similarly, and the analogy is still having a big impact on our industry today. The fact that our seats are getting crammed closer and closer together on the airplanes is a byproduct of free market pricing and deregulation that's been going on. C.H. Robinson is largely a byproduct of deregulation. Most everything that we do kind of came in the last 38 years. And with a similar motive around kind of opening up, speeding out, you know, improving the game of logistics, just like with the game of basketball. So the thing that I kill a lot of brain cells out late at night watching games, thinking about this, is there are a lot of analogies around how basketball has changed, how logistics has changed, and how rulemaking and innovation and how things work together. And while I'm a big believer that transportation deregulation and rule changes in the NBA both have been successful over a long period of time, it's also clear that the world is speeding up and it doesn't work quite like it used to in terms of how long these cycles work and how the rules get made. But I spent a lot of time thinking and wanted to share some thoughts today around what I find most fascinating is, why did it take 38 years for some of these rule changes to have the impact that they did in both our industry and in the NBA and lots of other things that we could point to as well too. And some of the thoughts that I would share with you is that obviously there's just pure change, that there's lots of stuff around how difficult it is to change and embrace it. I know in the NBA, the first few years, they didn't even try a lot of the three-point shots. And it's not that people couldn't envision that someday they might be more relevant, but it took a while to really think about changing the offenses, changing the approach, changing how you approach the game. Capital investment, when you think about our industry and all the trillions of dollars that are invested in long-term capital projects, there's a similarity in the NBA as well too. They have players on long-term contracts. They have a lot of investments in those big slow guys who weren't going to shoot threes. So it takes decades to change because you've got inertia, you've got change, you've got capital investment, both in transportation and basketball. On top of that, though, I would say probably the key thing is about execution and iterations of metrics and data. In the beginning, part of the problem was people couldn't make those shots with the same percentage. You see really over the last decade is how they got good at it. And they got good at it in part through some of the Moneyball stuff around thinking about where on the court do you take them, how do you change your offense to get more open to do them. I think Robinson and a lot of us are kind of byproducts of that transportation deregulation too, that a lot of the things that are happening today, we might have talked about it 20 or 25 years ago, but we had to get good at it, and we had to iterate around the metrics, and the defense or the competition responds to what you do, and then you have to iterate back and forth to sort of improve on it. So the message that I think is really important, it's been a big part of Robinson's success and part of the passion of the game that I have for basketball, is thinking about these inflection points, these rule changes. How do you innovate? How does the timing work? I don't think there's going to be a lot of things that we have 38 years to react to kind of going forward, that these cycles are obviously compressing. On the other hand, I do feel like the relationship between innovation, change, rulemaking, and timing, and how these things all kind of fit together is maybe equally as relevant as it's ever been in terms of figuring out our business models and our competitive approach and how we're all going to go about things.